erosion of driving back the Japanese island by island continued. In June 1944, yet more amphibious assaults began, this time in the Marianas Islands. The islands were important to both attacker and defender. The first target, Saipan, was an important Japanese base and within strategic bomber range of the Japanese home islands. The second U.S. objective, Guam, held important supplies of fresh water and was the best natural harbor in the Western Pacific. Guam would also be a base for bomber attacks on Japan and a starting point for attacks to recover the Philippine Islands. As so often in these invasions of Pacific islands, the battle on land was preceded by a naval battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea turned into the largest carrier battle of the war. The Japanese were outnumbered in nearly every aspect. The Americans had more than twice the aircraft, had 7 major carriers to Japan's 5, 8 light carriers to Japan's 4. Disparity in quantity was matched by difference in quality. After earlier battles, Japanese crews and pilots never regained the level of training and prowess they had enjoyed earlier in the war, and came to be surpassed in skill by the Americans. The quality of American radar and intelligence was also superior. A great air battle was fought, in which the Americans enjoyed such superiority that the fighting came to be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lost nearly 2/3 of their planes. 2 Japanese carriers were lost, 1 to air attack, 1 to a U.S. submarine. With the naval threat destroyed, U.S. Marines had to fight a stern battle to take Saipan. 4,000 Marine casualties were sustained in the first 2 days. An invasion planned to last 3 days stretched to 3 weeks. The terrain of Saipan meant that the U.S. soldiers were forced to make repeated frontal assaults against dug-in Japanese. The defenders fought with fanatical determination. In July, a mass suicide attack by the Japanese saw more than 4,000 Japanese troops killed in 1 day. Rather than surrender, many Japanese chose to die by their own hand. The delays caused in the taking of Saipan allowed both defenders and attackers of Guam to make full preparations. The Americans opened the assault with the heaviest air and naval bombardments of the Pacific War. More than half the 20,000 Japanese defenders were killed before a single U.S. Marine landed. Although Guam was secured easily, the remnants of the Japanese forces fought on. The last surrendered in 1972. As soon as the Marianas were secure, the U.S. Army Air Force began to turn the islands into bases to attack the Japanese. The raids were to be borne on the wings of a new aircraft, the B-29 Super Fortress. The B-29 was a huge aircraft that could carry a heavier bomb load at greater range than any other aircraft. At first, the planes had flown a tortuous route from bases in China, from where southern Japan was just in range. From November 1944, the Marianas had been turned into air bases. The first raids had been precision high-level attacks upon the Japanese aircraft industry. The raids were inconclusive. In the coming years, these tactics were to be abandoned in favor of mass area attacks against Japan's wooden cities. When ordered to retreat from the Philippine Islands in 1942, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur had famously promised to return. In late 1944, he gathered the forces to fulfill his vow. The Japanese occupation forces in the Philippines were ill-prepared to resist a U.S. invasion. Japan had entered the war in 1941 fully mobilized, with as many men as possible in uniform and industry at near capacity. the United States Navy had imposed a tight blockade around the Japanese islands that severely restricted Japan's capacity to wage war. In contrast, the U.S. Navy enjoyed an embarrassment of riches, able to draw from a well of near-bottomless resources. New battleships, new cruisers, new destroyers streamed from U.S. shipyards. Of the most important ships in the war, the aircraft carriers, no less than 21 new major carriers had been launched since Pearl Harbor, 5 times the equivalent number of Japanese ships. The total number of aircraft the Americans could embark was 3,000, 3 times the Japanese strength. In September 1944, U.S. carrier aircraft destroyed Japanese air forces on the Philippines. In October, MacArthur assembled a fleet of over 700 ships. And following a huge bombardment by battleships, U.S. troops landed on the Philippine island of Leyte. Japan responded with the dispatch of a massive naval force. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, as the battle was to be called, remains the largest naval battle in world history. The Japanese plan was for their aircraft carriers to lure away the American carriers from the landings. Meanwhile, a separate force of Japanese battleships would attack the troop transports and the landed forces. The Battle of Leyte Gulf has been described as the last throw of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Effectively, every major warship that remained to Japan was thrown into the gamble. The last reserves of ships, men, and aircraft were deployed to effect a decisive battle. The battle was, at the same time, a carrier battle, where the air forces of the 2 carrier fleets engaged each other and the enemy carriers. And it was traditional battle fleet engagement, where big gun battleships fought each other in duels of naval artillery. The battle was complex, as the 2 fleets divided their forces and searched for their enemy amongst the scattered Philippine islands. Admirals on both sides lost their nerve, then found renewed determination. Massive Japanese battleships, the largest in the world, surprised light U.S. carriers, which fought courageous actions against opponents many times their weight. Destroyers attacked each other, or mounted audacious attacks on much heavier ships. Ships were lost by both sides at Leyte, but the fortune of war smiled on America, and the result was a naval triumph which ranks as a victory alongside Trafalgar, as the U.S. Navy destroyed the Japanese. All 4 Japanese carriers and 2 of the battleships were sunk. Japanese Admiral Nishimura went down with his ship. With the naval battle resolved, the fighting on land began. MacArthur spectacularly waded ashore before the newsreel cameras. Further inland, 70,000 Japanese and 15,000 Americans died in the battle to establish a bridgehead. The Japanese failed to throw back the invaders, and a long battle for liberation began. It was at Leyte that a new word passed into the languages of the world: kamikaze. A kamikaze attack was a suicide attack by a pilot crashing his plane loaded with explosive onto an enemy warship. Throughout the war, in rage or fanatical desperation, Japanese aviators had crashed onto their enemies. It was at Leyte that the kamikaze attack became an official tactic. The kamikaze drew on Japanese mythology. The word kamikaze meant divine wind, and referred to a miraculous tempest that suddenly arose to destroy a Chinese invasion fleet approaching the defenseless shores of medieval Japan. Kamikaze attacks were not always by aircraft. Japan was to deploy midget submarines, human-piloted torpedoes, and even small manned rockets in suicide attacks. It was the converted fighter aircraft that were to be the most effective. At Leyte, a U.S. carrier and an Australian cruiser were to be the first victims of the divine wind.